Yeah,
comment,
I do too.
because it, I think that pertains to our.
So my question
Wow.
before.
Dick, we're live.
Yeah, we'll just do like, we're on? Good, okay. Good morning to those that are tuning in on KCWU Channel 2 and those that are here to the April 12th special meeting of the Ellensburg School Board. Today's special meeting is a continuation of the board's interview of architectural firms. Last week we interviewed architects, or ALSC architects, and Hudable and Ormus. First one was out of Spokane, the second one was out of Kirkland. And today's agenda is a continuation of that interview process, and our schedule for today is 10 to noon, and we will have a NAC, or better known as NAC, or Northwest Architectural, and I'll say yet third time architectural company out of Spokane, and then we will go until noon, and then at that time we'll take a break, and then we'll reconvene at 1 o'clock, and then we will have Architects West out of Coeur d'Alene, and then we'll run until 3 o'clock. And so today's session is pretty much like what we did the last Saturday. For those that are wondering, as the last tidbit is, we will be making a decision, and this is for the folks from NAC and Architects West. We have a meeting scheduled for Monday night, 5:30, I believe, at Howell Homes to discuss the interviews and make a selection, or make a decision, anyway, as to what the next steps are. So with that, I want to introduce Bill Grubage with Hill International, our construction manager firm, who's been assisting the board and the administration in doing these interviews, and I think I'll just go ahead and introduce Bill, and we'll go from there. I think I got everything covered, right? Correct, board?
You did good.
We did okay?
Yes.
So far, anyway? All right, good. So, Bill, have at it.
Good morning, board. Dr. Ferris. Just a reminder to those that are tuning in and those that are with us here this morning, the process is such. For the next 90 minutes, the design team will be presenting their answers to the homework that we assigned a couple weeks ago. There were 4 specific elements in that homework, and they will be addressing each of those 4. After that 90-minute period, they will, the board will ask 5 different prepared questions that have been shared with the design firm, and the design firm will respond to those questions. Once that is done, we have that surprise question that we will present to the design firm, a question that's intended to see how they respond in terms of planning their answer, and then how they present the answer. So with that, we'll get going. I'll introduce Tom Golden with NAC, and he'll start us off.
Great, thank you, Bill. I also want to start off by thanking you guys for this opportunity. We love to come in front of selection committees and pour our story out there and have you listen to it. I'll start with introductions. My name is Tom Golden, and my role officially is principal in charge. So if you're looking for the place where the buck stops, that would be it. But beyond that, and probably more important than that, is what my role in your eyes will be, and that is to be your constant advocate. We want to make sure that everything we do, every decision that we make, is going to fulfill your visions, your aspirations, and your expectations. And it's my job to challenge our team to consider those in every single decision that they make. I'm going to now turn it over to my colleagues and let them introduce themselves.
Good morning. My name is Melissa McFadgen. My role on this project is project manager. I basically grew up at NAC and started working on educational projects from the very beginning, and have discovered that I truly love working with school districts, with children, with teachers, with the community, creating spaces for our kids to grow and flourish. Most recently, I have been the project manager on the Cheney Middle School projects, as well as the Sela Middle School project, which is currently under construction. I look forward to the opportunity to work with Ellensburg School District and having 2 small children of my own, continuing advancing the educational facilities so that our kids have a bright future is a huge priority for me.
My name is Steve McNutt, and I too grew up at NAC and grew old at NAC, as you might recognize by the color of my hair. But I've been in the educational planning business for 40 years. And during that time, my principal assignment has been quite varied, but for your particular project, it would be focused on developing the program or educational specifications. And that's a task I've taken on multiple times, probably 30 to 40 of them under my belt, and at least a dozen middle schools, including recent contemporary middle schools that we've planned for Cheney and for Sela and for Meade, and most recently authoring the master middle school educational specifications for Spokane Public Schools, where they have in their sights 5 new middle schools coming up over their next capital planning cycles. So I'd be eager to work on that assignment for Ellensburg School District, and it's an assignment that I undertook in the planning for the high schools. So love the community, happy to be back.
Good morning, I'm Brent Harding, and I would be the principal in charge of design, and that really doesn't mean that I'll be sitting around drawing pretty pictures, although I do enjoy that. What it really means is I'll be an advocate for making sure all the programmatic needs of your facility are incorporated through all the discussion that we would have with your user groups and hearing out all their needs. I would be the person who made sure that all of that got implemented properly. And draw a few pretty pictures along the way. I've been with NAC Architecture for more than 20 years and completely focused on educational facility design, so good background there. My middle school specific experience started with Pullman Lincoln Middle School and followed through with roles in Meade's Mountainside Middle School, the 2 Cheney Middle Schools that I think you're familiar with. And most recently, I'm working with Sela School District and Shane Backlund on their new middle school that's currently under construction. And I thank you for having us here today.
A little background on how this team was assembled. It wasn't just because they had a free Saturday and wanted to come to Ellensburg. This is really our A team in terms of middle school design. In some form or fashion, this team has been responsible for all of our most recent middle schools in these particular roles. The identical team for Cheney, the 2 middle schools that we completed there in the last couple of years. Likewise, our engineering team is made up of proven players that we have worked with many times, who have a lot of not just K-12 school experience, school design, but specifically heavy on the middle school side as well. One thing that might take a little bit of explaining, we did list a couple of potential mechanical engineering firms, and the reason that we did that, we aren't going to say we have two mechanical engineers on the same project, but if perchance the option of a site-adapted middle school is chosen, we felt that it was important that the mechanical designer who did that project originally, we would recommend that they would continue on and work on that project as well. So we have some different middle schools with different mechanical engineers, so if depending on which plan might be chosen, we would want to go a particular direction. It's certainly not anything we have to resolve early on. We want to go through the process to see where it lands, so we can sort of kick that can down the road a little ways. Before we get to our homework, I want to talk a little bit about us, maybe for the benefit of those who are watching or who may not have been able to look at our statement of qualifications. If our name sounds a little familiar, that is because we were the architects for the high school project. We consider that a very successful project on a number of levels. So we do have experience here working in Ellensburg and working with a lot of you folks. Just kind of a description of the breadth of our portfolio. Between our office in Spokane and our sister office in Seattle, we count more than 60 school districts as clients. On this particular graphic, we have highlighted in red the Eastern Washington districts where we have actually done middle school work. So just kind of gives you a sense of how widespread we work across the state. We've been able to amass a portfolio that's well over $2 billion in construction costs across the state over the years. In terms of middle school experience, we've already mentioned a couple that we have done, but in our portfolio are nearly 40 separate middle school projects. Some of the more recent ones, Cheney and Westwood, two identical schools designed and built at the same time on 2 different sites. Brent mentioned Sela Middle School, under construction currently. Started off as sort of a partial remodel and addition, but ultimately the decision was to construct all new school on the same site. Mountainside Middle School is our most recent middle school for the Meade School District, and that's a nice, you'll see a little bit more about that one when we get into our homework assignments, but it's got a lot of similarities and sort of pertinent amenities that we want to talk about. And then Salk Middle School, which has just bid and is just starting construction in Spokane. We also have a significant amount of modernization projects in general. I think about 40% of our work overall is modernization projects as opposed to new construction. A couple that we've kind of shown here are extremely relevant, we think. Upper left is Lewis and Clark High School. It's a high school project, but it's got a lot, it had a wonderful central auditorium similar to Morgan, a little bit more elaborate and larger because it was on the high school level, but that was a complete restoration of that auditorium. So it carries some real significance here. Similarly, Rogers High School was, you can kind of see in this picture, there was a historic portion of that building that had been added onto, gosh, I don't know, 8 or 9 times. It was a mess. But we retained the historic original piece of that high school and then were able to add on in a sort of contemporary but sensitive way that respected that building and also gave them all the amenities of a 21st century high school. On the middle school level, again, Brent mentioned this was one of his projects. Lincoln Middle School down in Pullman, and that was a very invasive major remodel, moving spaces around, such as the gym moving from one place to another. So that was it was very significant and invasive. In terms of adapting buildings to other sites, we also have a fair amount of experience in that world. Back in the early 80s, in fact, our company was formed in part to design 15 prototypical elementary schools in Spokane. So it's sort of in our DNA, as we like to say. And more recently, we've been working with Moses Lake to design an elementary school. We designed the elementary school. They liked it enough that they said, hey, let's build it again on another site. And so we've now completed 2 and possibly more for them as they move forward. On the high school level, we've also designed 2 high schools simultaneously for Central Valley School District. And interesting thing there is that they were identical schools, except they were mirror images of each other. So it was an interesting little twist that you might even get lost in there if you were used to being in one and you go to the other one and you turn right instead of turn left. But I think they get used to it. And then most recently, in Cheney, Cheney replaced their one overcrowded middle school with 2 new ones, and they wanted one design for both schools, and so we came up with the best one for them and then adapted it to 2 different sites. And so that was a little bit challenging in figuring out the different sites and the different orientations, but we were able to make them identical. So overall, actually, let's get to the other factor that we want to talk about, which is getting the message out to the community and helping support your efforts with a bond issue. We are currently working with a number of school districts on this very same goal, and we have been successful with a number of school districts in the past. And that scope of work really ranges widely. Some school districts want to actually go through conceptual design and present a design of sorts to give the community a flavor of what the school would include. There are others that really don't necessarily want to go that far, and they just want to get the information out there. And then there are even other school districts, Deer Park comes to mind, where we actually went through formal design development all the way to that point before that issue was put on the ballot. So it really ranges widely in terms of what you want from us, what sort of support you want, and what kind of help we can give you. All right, enough about us. We want to get to our homework assignments with a slight little twist.
Yeah, we'd like to tinker with the order a little bit, if that's all right. Essentially, we'd like to address assignments 2, 3, and 4, and then come back to assignment number 1. By going to assignments 2, 3, and 4, we can convey to you our basis and understanding of the 3 fundamental approaches: modernization, assignment number 2, site adaptation, assignment number 3, and all new custom designed assignment number 4. So we kind of want to lay that foundation and then come back to assignment number 1 about community involvement and convey, on the basis of our description of these various pathways, how we would tell that story to the Ellensburg community. So anyway, hope we haven't violated some sacred rule, but we're headed down this path, and we can't change the order of the PowerPoint now.
Yeah, that would be a challenge.
So I'll turn it over to Tom, who's standing patiently at the podium, and he'll talk to you about the approach to modernization and how we would frame the context of it.
I want to talk, to begin with, a little bit about some challenges that are inherent to modernization in general and more specifically what the issues are that we see as the most important or most challenging for Morgan Middle School. First of all, there are, I think everybody is aware of some significant life safety and structural code upgrades that would need to happen there. I mean, obviously that's an issue because a lot of the building is not being used because of that reason. So what are we going to do about that? I know that there's at least a couple of structural analyses that have been done, and there are some recommendations in there about how to fix that. So we feel that, yes, we can overcome that challenge using that structural analysis as a roadmap. The student safety and security is always, and for good reason, a high concern. The additions to Morgan, and even the original building, designed in a completely different era where student safety was concerned. And over the last 15 years or so, that has really changed, and for good reason. It's a little bit harder to handle in a modernization than it might be in a new building. In a new building, usually good, prudent design will solve a lot of those issues in terms of controlling traffic on the site and diverting people where you want them to go. In a modernization, that can be a little more challenging. Classroom size is also an issue in modernizations, especially in the oldest sections of the school. A lot of those were designed smaller than today's ideal classroom. And you might say, well, let's just make them bigger, which is what we would want to do. Sometimes those are kind of hemmed in by structural limitations. You can't necessarily widen a classroom. You could maybe lengthen it, but you end up with a classroom that might have not ideal proportions, almost bowling alley-like classrooms. And then overall building efficiency kind of plays into that as well, especially in the case of Morgan, where there's been a lot of additions and circulation is sort of all over the place. We usually try to go in and increase the building efficiency by simplifying the circulation, eliminating a lot of bends and turns and blind spots in corridors. No matter how successful we are, it's never going to be as efficient as a brand new school. And so you pay a little bit of price in the form of additional area and a loss of building efficiency in a modernization. Building infrastructure, here we're talking mostly about the systems, the HVAC system, electrical, telecommunications. And our plan would be that all of that it needs to be fully replaced with modern, efficient systems for today. Site size is a big concern. You probably know that the state recommends a minimum middle school site at 17 to 20 acres. Morgan sits on less than 7. And so in short of purchasing property and vacating streets, I don't know that that's going to be a solvable issue. You've been able to deal with it up to this point, and so that's just something that maybe it's not solvable. And then a real concern also is how do you remodel a building that's occupied? There's safety concerns for students from construction traffic and just construction activities. The price you pay here usually is a little bit longer construction time, as you can turn over parts of the building and sort of have this hopscotch phasing plan that would ultimately result in a finished project, but it might take a little longer. Do we think we can overcome these challenges? The answer in most cases is yes. The one that is probably not going to, we won't be able to overcome completely is the size of the site. We can do some things to help the traffic, mitigate some of the traffic issues, and both vehicular and pedestrian, but it's still going to be on a 7-acre site. So how would we do this? Just kind of taking a look at the site itself and what some of the issues are there. We know that the main entry is pretty obscure. It's hard to know where you're supposed to go if you've never been there before. So we'd want to address that. We have some issues with conflicting traffic between buses and parent drop-off at the peak times of the day. We'd like to certainly address that. And even just from a security standpoint, there are a lot of exterior doors. Anytime you have an exterior door, you have potential for some security issues. So we'd want to certainly address that. Taking a look at the building itself, or buildings, this school has had a number of additions, obviously, but never does it seem like there's ever been a project that looked at it comprehensively. What do we want to do overall with this campus or this complex? It's sort of, we have some money, we need classrooms, let's add some classrooms. And so it kind of grew organically and not in a real cohesive, organized way. So we'd like to certainly address that. One of the real pluses of this is that auditorium. I mean, that's a real community asset in our minds, and it's kind of a jewel sitting there. Unfortunately, it can't be used right now, but that's something that we see as a real asset that would want to be saved and want to be upgraded and restored to its original glory. The other piece is the gym. When we went in there a couple weeks ago, I was kind of felt like I walked onto the set of Hoosiers and Jimmy Chitwood was going to come running out of the locker room and sink the winning basket for Hickory, but it just had this charm that it's kind of hard to duplicate, and it's been functioning well for quite a long time, but it certainly needs some upgrades. So we took a look at how we might work this campus, and we did it in two different ways. First, it was how do we maximize our cost savings by remodeling versus building new. And so to take a look at that, we would propose, and again, this is just one idea. There are a number of potential ideas ways that this school could be modernized. But the guiding principle here is let's modernize everything we can, save as much of the building as we can, and then add where we need to. And so in this particular scheme, we have left all of this as it is in terms of exterior walls and size, but we've renovated everything. And then to solve the entry issue, we're kind of looking at maybe an addition here that speaks to the character of the original building. We could provide a main entry and possibly move the library to that area as well. Administration, you'd be walking right into the administration area, which is sort of a good fundamental security concept. We would propose a gym addition on the south side of the existing gym to give you more flexibility with gym space. And then in order to replace the portables, we would propose a classroom addition sort of added to the existing 1966 piece of the building. We would also, as we move administration out, we could expand commons and cafeteria into a real sort of heart of the school. So that's sort of what we're looking at here. Again, keep in mind that the motivation behind this was to capitalize on as much cost savings as we possibly could. It's going to be less expensive to remodel than it is to build, as a rule of thumb. But we also wanted to look at it from the other end. Does this really solve your issues going into the future 40, 50 years? We see this as maybe your one shot to improve the middle school for a long time to come. And you could argue that in some ways this just sort of perpetuates some of the things that were done to the school in the past. And do we really want to do that? So we took another look at it and kind of lost the motivation in terms of saving money necessarily, although we don't really know exactly where this scheme, well, let me just go through it a little bit. We felt like what we wanted to do here was preserve what was really the asset of the school, which is the existing original building, the auditorium, and the gym. And we would renovate those spaces, bring them up to current code and 21st century instructional spaces. And then we would remove the classroom wings that were sort of tacked on in front of that original building and kind of restore this to its original form and character. Then we would add new space out along First Avenue, similar in concept in that we create a main entry. We have commons kind of in the middle that could open out onto this new courtyard that is formed by removing some of the other buildings. And it starts to really simplify the circulation and kind of gets a bit more new school organization to it that would really clean up a lot of the circulation issues that occur right now in the school. So again, those are sort of one extreme, maybe the other extreme, where the actual solution might land in between there. That's something that we would love to figure out with you guys as we go forward. Just kind of summarizing then what the pros and cons of modernizing would be. On the pro side, I mentioned it before, but it's typically 80 to 85% of new construction, remodel construction costs would be 80 to 85% of a new building. Now, when you start needing a lot of structural upgrades, when you start building more new space than you're remodeling, those numbers are going to go up to possibly the same cost, or in some cases even more than a new building might. Saving the building would be a sustainable option. It would certainly keep a lot of material out of landfills. It's just sort of an environmental benefit. There's, as I mentioned, real community assets, especially the auditorium, that would be preserved. The sense of nostalgia and connections that the community has with that school would be preserved. That's a hard thing to quantify, but it's certainly a factor. It solves the question, what do we do with this old school if we replace it? Is it just going to sit there empty? What do we do with that? That question is completely off the table. And it's in a neighborhood that's already a school, so the traffic patterns are established. The traffic is not going to increase by modernizing. It's already there. On the negative side, and I kind of mentioned this, if it's difficult to upgrade, then that's going to start eroding the savings that you want to capture by remodeling. You're always going to have some compromise in the building efficiency, the classroom size, the way it's laid out. And we know that there's going to be a compromise. It's just how much compromise is tolerable. The site size, again, that's a tough one. Although you have been living with it now for quite a while, so you're good at it. And it may not be the most fiscally responsible. It's sort of a subjective kind of look at it, but it seems it's like driving an old car that starts to break down. You know, when is the point where you're putting more money into it than the value you're getting out of it? And that point is different for everyone. And just the challenges of remodeling a building while it's occupied. It requires some complex phasing, some extra steps, and potentially a little bit longer project. So we took all of these things, and Steve will explain this a little bit more, but we kind of created a report card for each of these different versions.
We're running miles with this homework metaphor, and essentially, you've asked us to do these pros and cons, but we didn't want to leave those pros and cons just kind of floating in outer space, kind of unrelated. So what we tried to do was, as Tom just said, is create a report card for each option that is universally applied. It has more application to some than others, but as Tom pointed out, we will have a host of evaluation factors, some of which will apply very pointedly towards the option that we're rolling out, and some will have some vague reference, but we wanted to at least try to tie them together as best we can. So we've got, you know, the evaluation factor of nostalgia and school spirit, and essentially that's the question of community emotional attachment to the facility, and that's inherent in this modernization, so it gets a grade A. And all of these grades and factors are unilaterally put forward by us, and therefore we do this with a bit of caution, knowing that really you folks should help us figure out the factors and the ratings. But just to demonstrate how it works, we're often running, and hopefully not running off the end of some tree limb that's going to collapse on us. But anyway, does it solve the Morgan future question? Yes, absolutely. So it gets a grade A. The project cost, in the best case, where you are very conservative about retaining assets, that it gets a grade A, because the numbers we crunch say you can probably save, you know, $1 million, $1.5 million by doing that. Project cost, worst case, within very invasive modernization and recognizing the shortcomings of efficiency and the improvements that you'll have to make to the structural shell. We've run some numbers that say it's going to get up to close to 99% of all new. So just depending on where you are in that varying scale, you can be from a grade A to a grade C. Time savings, there's none. And in fact, we gave it a C- because in terms of execution, you're going to be playing a lot of hopscotch and delay time, phasing, construction, so it probably wouldn't come together as quickly as an all-new project or a replacement project. Meeting program needs, it'll probably meet the program needs in 80% of the cases, but there's going to be probably 20% of those situations where you're going to have to live with some kind of compromise, odd-shaped classrooms or configurations that aren't ideal. And we see that time and time again on modernizations. Performing arts needs, yes, it's a fabulous asset there. And performing arts is a huge criterion that we need to judge all of these options by. Systems and product preferences, those can be tailored to the Ellensburg preferences, because it will be customized for your needs, even though it's a modernization. Area efficiency, that will be a little bit difficult, and what we have traditionally seen is that you have to add more gross square footage to the overall complex to make up for the area inefficiency of an imperfect layout, of a less than perfectly efficient layout. plan organization. We are going to be constrained by some existing geometries, so it will be difficult to reorganize optimally. That doesn't mean it's going to be fatally flawed, but it's going to get a lower grade. Site issues, Tom talked about those. This one gets low grades on parking and busing and playfield and outdoor education, traffic, and overall site fit. It's got some pretty low grades, and especially on outdoor education, because we're talking about adding gyms, we're talking about adding classrooms, and just consuming more and more green space. So maybe one of the lowest grades on the whole scale. And then we've got an evaluation factor. Can you kick the tires? Yes, you can do that on a site adapt, but no, you can't do that on the building that you have. At least, I mean, you can insofar as you know what the auditorium is going to be like, but in terms of being able to go out into the showroom of the new spaces, you're going to have to do that on paper and not be able to visit another site. But anyway, just an orientation to the evaluation factors, and again, we want to tie all this together so that we can look at them side by side at the end of this process. And now we're going to switch to Melissa, who will take us to homework assignment number 3, and that's the site adaptation of an existing design on your site.
So homework assignment number 3, a site adapt project. Essentially taking a floor plan that has already been constructed somewhere, whether it's one of the 40 that we've come up with or one from another architect, and taking it and putting it on your site. Probably the most important piece to start off with is program prioritization. And the reason for this is because when all of those 40 middle schools were generated, they were working with a priority set that was that particular school district's priorities. Your priorities may or may not be in alignment with that, and what our goal would be to find which plan had the program meet yours as close as possible. And essentially, it ranges the full gamut from science classrooms. Some science classrooms, like at Cheney Middle Schools, they were outfitted very, very basically. There was no gas, there was nothing more than essentially additional counter and workspace. At Mean Mountainside, it was more akin to a high school laboratory environment. And those are some of the things that we would work with you to sort of establish and really nail down what are the pieces that we have to have in the new program. And with that sort of comes the other piece to it is curriculum compromise. What are the pieces that we are willing to compromise? When we toured the Morgan Middle School, we heard that the special needs program, that's critical. It's something that is very, very important to the school. It's important for those similar facilities to be retained. What plan out there is going to accomplish those goals? Successful PE program. There was also the library as a very active, agile space, and the desire to keep those components continuing forward. Traditionally in middle schools, there is not a full performing arts center. So I think that as we begin to evaluate the different floor plan options available, that would probably be a hurdle that we would find repeatedly, because in most middle school programs, there's sort of a stage scenario where, or a stage off a common scenario where you have a common space that is multifunction. You can you eat lunch there, you have a variety of educational activities there, and then before and after school it can also serve as a community performing space. But there's not the grandeur that you currently have with the Morgan Middle School. School spirit, that's a huge concern. It is. It's something that, again, with a site adapt project, that was built for the school spirit for that school. How do we do our best to take the Hall of Scholars that's in Morgan Middle School and put that into a new site adapt program that was developed for someone else's school spirit? Site configuration. In an all-new opportunity, again, there's that level of prioritization and the ability to say, we want a 4-story building because we want to maximize our site. Or we want a variety of courtyard spaces. And so we organize the plan in a way that would allow you to achieve the desired outdoor spaces. And then an occupied site. Although not as dramatic as Morgan Middle School, there are still high schoolers that will be attending school here. There will be traffic to and from the elementary school, and just being cognizant of that and working around those. So what we've done is taken a few of our plans to say, all right, here's our clean slate. As all of you are aware, this is sort of an overview. East 3rd Avenue to the north, the existing district administration building, Ellensburg High School, Valley View Elementary School. And from what we've heard before, there's a desire to preserve the majority of these play spaces here. Of course, minimize our impact to the existing high school. Zooming in a little bit further, here's where we're at. What plan will fit best on this site? We took a project, Glacier View Middle School. It's a primarily two-story building, and we thought, what does this look like on the site? It's a pretty efficient plan in terms of it being long and linear. That's something that we felt was important on the site to sort of maximize that buffer that you could have potentially between middle school and the elementary school. Condensed traffic and access off the north side. But it is very long and narrow. And so what you're seeing is it's essentially stretching from curb to curb. The key impact for a site adapt project is to minimize the amount of modifications you make. Once you start picking away and modifying a site adapt plan, the cost and time savings that you were expecting to realize start to diminish. And that again goes back to that program prioritization and really figuring out what program fits best so that you can maximize that time and cost savings. In this particular program, there wasn't a full-fledged performing arts center. How would we plug that in? Fortunately, the way that the plan is oriented, there is the purple color here is the existing performing arts spaces. And so it actually works very, very well to continue off the end and add a new auditorium. You could potentially have parking here, easy access, easily sharing this facility with the high school, and minimizing the impact to the existing design. So let's take a look at another option. We take this plan and rotate it 90 degrees. Again, a long linear site, a long linear building running from curb to curb. Is this what you want? Will this achieve your goals? It does a good job of sort of maximizing, again, retaining playfield area, the buffer between the two schools. You have a lot of very comfortable courtyard spaces that open onto greater open area, which is a very safe approach to courtyards, easily viewable, minimize hiding spaces. And again, with the way that this particular plan works, you could easily add an auditorium. Access right off the existing high school parking lot, very close proximity to the existing high school, making it something that is easy to plug in, and again, maximizing that time and cost savings for the site adapt approach. Another option, Cheney Middle School. What happens when you put a one-story school on the site? This plan was organized very, very specifically for the Cheney School District. They wanted a central common space with the ability to stand in essentially one location and view down each of the classroom wings. This is backed by the performing arts space and the gymnasium. As you can see, what this does to your site is it starts to kind of split it apart. You have a lot of smaller areas that may or may not be usable for your programs. At Cheney, they were able to use these spaces. These were educational areas that were very important parts of their curriculum. Would they be important parts for your curriculum? Those are the pieces to ask yourselves. And again, with the way that this plan is splayed, it starts to get difficult. Where would you put in a performing arts center that's a 2-story space that could be used? What about making it a standalone facility? Would that be an option? This is a community gym now. Does it make sense if you choose a plan that works for you best, but you can't fit that auditorium component in? Do you make it a standalone facility where you don't have internal access from the middle or the high school, but you do have a community gym that's standing there that's sort of neutral territory? Community members can access it. High schoolers, middle schoolers, it becomes its own unique piece. Something for consideration. May be the right answer, may not be the right answer. And a third option that we evaluated was Meade Middle School. This particular project, there's a north-south spine. On the right-hand side of that spine is 2-story classroom wings. And on the left-hand side is the specialty spaces, the athletics complex, and then a commons that kind of spills out. In this particular approach, it actually works pretty well. It's kind of a good balance between the two. You still have lots of area around the middle school, buffering it from the high school. And again, that fortunate aspect of the location of the current performing arts facilities. It allows us to plug in a new auditorium relatively easily without impacting what's going on with the original plan. So with that, to summarize, the site adapt pros and cons. I think I kind of hit the cost and time savings over the head. Basically, that would be two of the primary advantages of going with this approach. The key is to find out your areas that you have to have that you can't compromise on in program, both interior and exterior. You have the ability to tour existing buildings. When we start talking about this and you say, wow, I think this school has a great performing arts area or athletic complex, let's go take a look. We can actually go and visit the facilities. That is one thing that is very difficult with architecture. We don't get a chance very often to build prototypes. We're not the car industry where you build one and let it be on the road for a year, work out the kinks, and then you build the one that works efficiently, effectively for everyone. That's a huge pro for the site adapt approach. You have a very reliable cost framework for that particular project. You know that it was constructed, you know what the issues were, you know how much it cost, and you can use that data. And that's something that is very tangible. And again, the ability to take advantage of lessons learned. We all do our best working with the community, working with the educators to build a building that is as perfect as possible. We are not happy unless you're happy. But once something's constructed, there's always pieces that are items that you would change. You would have the opportunity to vet those out and make modifications and fix those spaces that you would see. The cons, the cost savings are not as significant as perceived. For a site adapt project, the construction cost remains the same. That's fixed. For the savings, you're really only getting savings from the basic design service fee. The basic design service fees are 8% of the project. We would anticipate of those fees, you could potentially save 20 to 25%. Again, taking into consideration that you are not making modifications. The more you make modifications, the more that 20 to 25% becomes reduced. And then on top of that, those fee funds are state matched. And so of that savings, you're only getting back, the local funds that you're getting back are only 50% of that. So when you sort of run all those numbers out, in the grand scheme of things, in the optimum condition, you're really only saving about 1% of the project budget. Compromise in curriculum program.
That's the question you have to ask yourself. Is that savings worth compromising your curriculum and program? We will do our best to find the right match for you, but it's not going to be an exact match. Analysis and modification to current codes. In the 2012 IBC, Ellensburg, there was sort of a recategorization of the seismic zones, and Ellensburg stepped up into a higher, more restrictive seismic zone. So with that being said, that means that the schools that were designed on the east side of the state, they would have to be reanalyzed structurally to meet the more restrictive code requirements. The plans that were designed on the west side of the state don't have snow loads considered into them. So those would have to be reanalyzed. So something for consideration. Depending on how old the building is, you could or could not.
I just say, wow, I mean, one side of the state versus the other side of the state, we're getting the double whammy. So.
It is a conundrum, that is for sure. And that's just something for consideration, is that those are really tangible things that would have to be evaluated and upgraded. Existing design may not fit desired site. As you saw with the Cheney Middle School site, when we put that down, let's say that aligned perfectly with your program. We put it on the site. Does that work the best? That's something that we have to take into consideration and could be a potential con. And then again, depending on how old the building is, certain products are discontinued constantly, and that's not only finishes, that's different systems, that there's just a wide variety of things that go into the building, and those are constantly changing. And that's a piece that we would have to reevaluate and make sure that what we have specified or what was included in the previous design is now currently available.
And here we're back to our report card and trying to evaluate this one on the same basis. The factor of nostalgia, school spirit, kind of the emotional connection, it gets a lower grade, obviously. Solves the Morgan future, not really. The future is less certain, but there are viable uses foreseen for Morgan. The project cost, in the best case, it will save a little bit of money so long as you don't take an off-the-shelf plan and tinker with it too much. But the more you do tinker with it and modify it, it ramps up to cost almost as much, within 0.5% of what an all-new custom design would be. The time savings is genuine, but only if there are minimal savings in the design phase. That's where most of the time savings is, because it's going to take as much time to construct this as it would a custom building. Does it meet the program needs? Probably 85%, but yes, but 15%, maybe not. Maybe it doesn't have the right mix of curriculum fit, and maybe it doesn't have the performing arts component that you desire, which would be unusual, since about half of our middle schools have performing arts and half of them have none programmatically. Systems and product preferences could be easily customized. That's a problem, because what are invested in the off-the-shelf plans are the preferences of all the original school districts. So if your preferences deviate from those in terms of systems and products, then all of those would have to be changed and recustomized for Ellensburg. Area efficiency, generally it's good. Plan organization, generally good. The site issues can vary depending on the configuration of the school. And can you kick the tires? There it gets an A grade. Yes, you can go out and visit those schools and say, gee, I like this, I don't like that, we'd like to fix this, we'd like to fix that, those kind of things. So anyway, there's our trial balloon scorecard for this one. And I'll switch gears now to homework assignment number 4, Brent, who will give you a guide to how we would approach an all-new custom design.
So the challenges for a custom new design building are somewhat similar to those of a site adapt, but I'll kind of walk through what might be different. Cost and time management really is an issue for any design project, and And NAC architecture has a long history of designing school buildings and meeting cost and time challenges, so I won't dwell on that long. Inventing a new custom building concept. A new building is a new design based on a very unique program that we would work with Ellensburg School District to develop. And so it's not like developing cars where you get years and years of R&D. You custom design this one new building and you move into it and start using it. Again, we've done that over and over again, and we're very familiar with how that works and have a lot of background and experience to help us make good decisions and lead you towards good solutions that way. Performing Arts Center, very similar here to the Site Adapt, but this approach really has the most flexibility to incorporate it in a way that is sort of seamless and feels like it's part of the original design, as opposed to sort of tacked on in a way that wasn't originally intended. School spirit, it really comes down to a question of whether the intent is to try to transition sort of an existing Morgan Middle School spirit to this new building by incorporating elements from the old building, you know, literally borrowing the architecture and bringing it over and installing it at the new building, or putting in displays or something along those nature that allude to the nostalgia and those kinds of approaches. Site configuration, really I think the goal here would be to minimize the footprint of the new building and try to preserve as much of the existing green space as possible. And when you're doing a new design, you really have a lot more flexibility to do that. You can work with your conditions and compress, sort of optimizing that. And we're working with an occupied site of, obviously, with the existing high school. And so really the challenge there would be to facilitate the construction process mostly in terms of contractor laydown area and trying to manage that so that it has as little impact on the function of the site as possible. So how would we do these things? This is, of course, the site, kind of the clean slate. It's a relatively small site, about 12 acres of open space to work with. As Tom mentioned, OSBI recommends about 17. It works, though, because you have the track and some play fields off by Valley View Elementary School to work with. It helps sort of deal with the part of that 17 acres that would normally be allocated to play fields. The tennis and parking, we think, are an important, I don't know if I can get the cursor up here. The tennis and parking up by the transportation facility are sort of key elements to retain, I think, in terms of buffering between the new building site and the transportation. The existing high school to the west and the parking to the south and the track, you know, just all the site features around this are sort of constraints that you have to respond to in appropriate ways in terms of either creating good access to parking or good buffer zone relative to the high school, dealing with the on-site existing parking on 3rd Street side, those kinds of things. One really nice benefit of this site is it's flat. That's very positive thing in terms of developing large school footprints. It makes for relatively economical constructions. You're not dealing with lots of grade changes and that kind of thing. But ultimately, any development on this site is going to displace some play fields. And fortunately, it appears that you have some land bank to work with over by the elementary school that'll help deal with that. So this is showing a concept for how you might begin to look at placing a new design on this site. It represents a sort of a assumed program that's based on what we've read from your previous bond literature. So all the size elements are to scale. It's giving you a real sense of how much area is necessary out of the site to accommodate a school. I'll step back just a little bit. The first stage in development will be ed specs, and ed specs will, of course, be optimized with a new building approach. In other words, you don't have to live with the existing program from a site adapt. You don't have to live with sort of shoehorning a program into your existing building at Morgan. Here, you can kind of step back and look at your curricular needs and what you would optimally do and tailor the menu of spaces around that so that you can develop the precise building that you really want. So I'm going to switch views and look at it from the other side, because I'd like to take you on a tour of, this is the same plan, but I'd like to take you on the tour kind of looking at it from the front entry. From a site standpoint, we're sort of thinking that you address you don't want to replicate the mistakes of the on-street drop-off and busing that are currently happening at Morgan. So we're sort of proposing that you have sort of this loop that goes around the parking lot, enters off 3rd Street here, has a drop-off lane along the building, and then the traffic comes back out and onto the street. And we have a separate bus drop-off lane that comes along the east side of the site, linking all the way through from street to street, and keeping those two components separate from one another. That's sort of one of the golden rules of school design is separation of buses and parents. As far as staff parking would be inside this loop, and then the front entry building, well oriented toward the drop-off and parking. We have the building sort of zoned along a major spine running down the middle, off which sort of special types classrooms like shop or those kinds of things might be out in the end, where they could be zoned away from other things because of noise, those kinds of issues. We have a couple of wings of classrooms, creating some courtyards out onto the play fields. At the entry, you'd enter near the administration. We have the library shown sort of above the administration with a connection onto the commons. We understand sort of the desire for the library to be the heart of the school oftentimes. Sort of a service zone, gymnasium, and performing arts spaces, because they are large community events with lots of people coming and going, oriented towards the south end near the existing parking lot, where they can sort of take advantage of that extra parking capacity. So with that, I'm going to shift to the pros and cons. Really, I think I showed that the site plan can potentially optimize sort of your relationship to the fit of the building, both into the site and into the neighborhood. You have a lot more flexibility to massage how that plan works, to take care of all the sort of influencing issues, more so than with a site adapt, where you sort of just have to plunk an existing plan onto the site and it fits how it fits and you fill in around it. Another opportunity in a new building that way is to carry over the sort of the vibrant special needs program that we visited with Michelle about over at the middle school. And again, to sort of make a central library that's the heart and soul of the building, which is very common in middle schools. the Hall of Scholars that Melissa talked about, there's a lot of opportunities for how to maybe reinterpret that in a new design and incorporate something that alludes to that sort of important cultural thing that they have in that building, but maybe in a new and different way. The new design may optimize the ability to share the use of facilities. For example, the play fields, obviously with 3 buildings on one site, there's ample opportunity for shared play field uses. With a performing arts center incorporated, again, that can be shared between the new building and the high school. And there are some questions about whether that facility should be part of the middle school or maybe stand alone, as Melissa talked about. There's pros and cons both ways. High school shop space may be an opportunity to save a little money in the new middle school if there is capacity of the existing high school shop space to facilitate use by the middle school students. Systems and products can meet school districts. Obviously, we're starting from scratch. We can meet all of your specific requirements or desires that way. And no phasing issues. Tom talked about the challenges of phasing and a modernization. The site adapt and the new building really have similarities this way on this site. There really aren't any phasing issues other than dealing with the contractor lay down space and temporarily not being able to use those play fields because it will take up most of that green space to park and sort of stage their construction activities. As far as cons, it's been talked about that the new design concept is likely the most expensive, although there's a lot of variables that play into that. And you've heard those stories over the course of the few years you've been sort of working towards this project. And but it likely is the more expensive of the 3. The real issue to maybe think about there is that it's the cost differences are fairly small between the 3 options you're contemplating. And so it may really come down to value. So you need to weigh the compromises you make in the site adapt and modernization approaches against sort of the optimization that you buy through a new building approach. Less predictability of cost is a bit of a concern because you're not kicking the tires so much. You don't have a lot of history to fall back on with a new design other than the fact that we've designed 40 middle schools and we can apply a lot of those lessons learned to this exercise. We've talked about the issue of kicking the tires. Again, you don't have that opportunity with a new design. Longer design time is a little bit of an issue with a new building compared to a site adapt. Obviously, you're starting from scratch with a new. Same thing with a modernization. And ultimately, I think maybe the biggest concern of doing anything on this high school site is that you're left with a mostly unoccupied existing Morgan Middle School. And there's sort of some big questions about how you deal with that. So I'll move on to Steve.
And again, we're putting this on our master report card in terms of nostalgia, school spirit, community attachment. There are some customization opportunities there, but it still gets kind of a low grade. The Morgan future question, it's less certain again, but there are viable uses foreseen. The project cost, best case, and the worst case is going to be the highest cost. Time savings, there will be none. Meeting program needs, this is where it starts to get A grades because yes, you can fully customize it. Performing arts, again, an A grade. Systems and product preferences, customized for you, an A grade. Area efficiency, we can make this, we got a blank slate, presumably we can make this the most efficient plan. Plan organization, again, optimal organization opportunities. The site issues kind of float around between B and C grades relative to the site adapt approach, but the overall site fit, we give ourselves an A grade because theoretically we should be able to make this one fit the best on that site of all the opportunities. And then can you kick the tires? No, you really can't. I'm going to move to the podium now. Tom's going to give you the view of the master report card.
So here is the first chance you get to see all of these together, sort of relative to each other. And what you find, we kind of averaged it out, not necessarily a grade point average, but a letter grade at the bottom. And what it shows is, and again, these are sort of our takes on all of this. So obviously, if we work with you, some of these grades would change. But what it says, it sort of leads you in a certain direction, but it's not. It doesn't sort of hit you over the head with, aha, this is what we should do. I mean, all of these are difficult questions to ask, difficult issues to deal with. But that's just kind of the process that we would go through.
Now I want to move back to homework assignment number 1 and describe the approach you recommend to enhance community involvement in the bond planning activity and identify the cost. I'm going to first talk about the tools, and this is sort of a backwards way to approach this, but I want to impress you with the fact that we've done this many times for many school districts, and we have a lot of tools in our toolbox, things that we can apply to your benefit, we think. We've done informational brochures, display boards, we've worked on website, Facebook installation stuff, public presentations, PowerPoints, and you can see that all the way along, we'd like to try to integrate the flavor and culture of the Morgan Middle School and the community at large. Some examples across the bottom there, the Meads, I think that's the Mead School bond on the left, and these are what we call our storyboards. Those boards were posted in every school district around the district and in many retail establishments. We've done that quite typically and very successfully in some school districts. In the top center there is the Pullman High School storyboard, which has some correlation to the Ellensburg assignment, because in this particular case, the site fit and the constraints of the site had the community very much puzzled and had sort of scratching their heads about how we would approach it. So that was one of the things that we just dove into head first and made sure that we solved and displayed the solution to that. Behind that, overlapping that and hidden behind it is a storyboard coming up for an anticipated bond election in Cheney for major modernization in addition to its high school. But what it does is show a roadmap of the existing school and highlights all the acute problems that they have to face and tells the story of how to fix that. And on the right is one that's close to home here, Sela, the middle school there, talking about the story there, which included their dilemma about how to handle performing arts, which they didn't have housed very well at the high school. There was no capacity, no auditorium facility for that. They had it wedged into an elementary school that was going to be abandoned. So key to that story was to tell the community how that would be addressed at their middle school. So telling the story about what is the fun, telling the story involves a number of components, answering questions, what is the fundamental need? And I think you have a host of fundamental needs that range from life safety to structural problems to a 1929 building that's kind of outgrown a contemporary curriculum, to the crisis of separation between the grades. So I think the fundamental need is something that you folks understand and can easily convey. We can help you do that. What options were considered? And I hope we've given you a flavor of those options today, and that's why we push this towards the end. And I think there's sort of an education piece where we need to be sensitive, and I want to emphasize that we bring an attitude of understanding of the Ellensburg situation, where there has been sort of a fragmentation and difference of opinions about how to approach this. And we wanted to represent to you that we would do that very objectively and very open-mindedly, and that we have the ability to explore the three available pathways and compare those apples to apples in a way that would be meaningful and, I think, fresh to the community. So we're hoping that we can undergird our support to you with that ability. A collateral question, of course, is what is the future of Morgan if some of the other options are selected instead, and obviously we need to address that head on. How do the costs compare? The costs are going to, we've run a bunch of cost numbers, and I'll show you those in a minute, but essentially what happens once you kind of put all of the options on an apples-to-apples scale, there's going to be very little difference between the costs, probably in the range of 1 to 1.5%. But there's a lot of homework you need to do to get to that conclusion. I'll give you a sense of that in a minute. What are the site complications and how are they addressed? And obviously, we hope that it's obvious in our presentation that we've addressed those site complications not only at the Morgan site, but at the high school and Valley View site, and are prepared to convey that story. What is the selected plan and how does it work? Well, why have we gravitated to a particular plan, and what are its strengths that stand out above the alternative plans? What's the cost to the taxpayers? And that's a big message that, of course, would work out with your financial analysts. I think it's John Gores in this case, is that correct? We worked with John and D.A. Davidson on many of our school districts and sort of held hands and helped tell that story together. What funding does the state provide? And we took a sort of a fresh look at that, and we think there's more potential for state funding out there than what you had forecast in your last bond election, maybe up to $1 million more. And what is the project timeline? People always want to know the project timeline. It will vary with whatever path you take, but not significantly if you dip into the state funding, because the project, if you go to the state funding route and wait for state assistance, that puts all the projects at the same June starting line and puts all the projects at more or less the same finish line. Under financial homework, there's a lot of legwork. There's two big components that we have to do some homework with you about in much depth. And one is financial and one is programming or ed specs. And I want to give you a little sense of that because we've got to explore savings potentials, understand limitations, scrutinize costs, consider community expectations, and arrive at a best option. And that takes a lot of legwork. And if this computer works for me, I don't want to completely disorient you with a blizzard of numbers. But what we have done is built detailed project budgets for all of the various options. And this one, I think, is the all-new middle school, or yeah, full replacement middle school, and put in all the project parameters, the cost per square foot. We've divided all the hard costs and the soft costs into the local dollars and the state matchable dollars, and we work ourselves down to a bottom line. And we've done this on all of these options. It would be important for us to wade in with you and with Bill Grubich to validate these and cross-compare these, but we want to do this, as I said in the beginning, on a very open-minded, apples-to-apples comparison basis. And essentially what it boils down to, the bottom line is those bottom lines will float from total project costs in our exercise between a high $46 million and the high $47 million, and the local costs in the $36 to $37 million range. That's the snapshots that we're making right now. But again, I don't want to sort of pick that hill to die on. We really need to wade into this in some depth with you folks. I just wanted to give you a sense of how we would approach that.
That'd be present day dollars.
Yeah, yes. No, those are projected future dollars.
Future.
Yeah, those are actual, yeah.
Okay.
So Tom, how do I get out of this? And how do I close that? Oh, on my screen. Okay, now.
We're good at architecture.
Yeah. You're looking at a Luddite here, I'm sorry, when it comes to computer stuff.
Hey, Steve, it's okay. We can all appreciate that.
And here I want to give you a sense of the programming, and this is the sort of my bailiwick. I'd be assigned to educational specifications, and what this does is give you a blizzard of numbers again, but essentially this is the SALC model of our latest middle school ed specs, and here's all the SALC spaces that are built in its area summary, the full menu of all the rooms. And here's Mead's Mountainside, and here's Cheney's school, and here's Sela's middle school, and here's what we've been able to excerpt from your middle school bond stuff. Now there's some interesting numbers in here. For example, this group of numbers shows the amount of space that was assigned to administrative offices and counseling spaces in all the other schools. And interestingly, Ellensburg's assigned allotment is 3,600 square feet, and it is at 99% of the average, within 1% of the average, and only 37 square feet off the average. So you're on par there. Now when you go down to classrooms, though, you're building a larger middle school capacity than all of the others. So you're at 125% of the average of all of the others, and that makes sense. You go to the common spaces, and in this case I'm looking at technology labs, and I'm assuming this to be an open, unassigned computer labs, and you've got a little less space assigned than the other schools that we have in our models. And that's not to say it's right or wrong. It's just these are interesting comparisons. Art, you've targeted a little larger space than average, 23% over the size, not a big number overall, 340 square feet. I know you have a very robust art program, or did when we did the high school. Maybe it carries over here. In the CTE and technology, vocational stuff, the allocation is 2,800 square feet, and that's a little under the average of the other two schools, of the other schools. The band and instrumental, you're right on par with what we would normally do with a band room. The choir space is a little bit higher than what we have seen typically. The science spaces are, again, right on par with the averages. Special services, that is special education, and your number is 3920. That's 74% of the average. It's a little low, and I was kind of surprised because of the emphasis that Michelle put on that, but I don't know what the demographic is, and this number floats up and down with whatever your special ed demographic is. The library media center is again on par. You're 96% of the average. Oops. The performing arts is way above average, 313%, and that's because you have a huge commitment to performing arts, and most of our middle schools, 2 of them on this list don't have any. I'm comparing it to the ones that do, that are much more modest and at a middle school scale. The one and all of that makes sense because of your local priorities. The one question that I would ask is, I have some concern about, is the auditorium seating, the fixed seating at 300. The space allocation for that was 2,500 feet, and that seems to be a little bit light. But anyway, those are just kind of questions from left field that you can ignore for now, really. The health and fitness, you're a little stronger than the average, about 2,500 square feet above average. Custodial space is a little stronger, but not a lot of space there. Nutrition services, almost dead on par with everyone else. Same with public support spaces, and same with same with miscellaneous spaces, staff, restrooms, other odds and ends spaces. The bottom line concern that I have here is that you're low on circulation allocation. Maybe that can be offset with some that are high above. And here, if I carefully count, a conservative count of your teaching station allocation and capacity, based on your bond issue list, would have about 37 and a half spaces that you would schedule full times for students. That's a conservative approach. Now, if you take the 2 tech labs and bump those into there and say you're going to schedule those all day, then you're up to 39 and a half. But you've got to get to 41 and a half regularly scheduled teaching stations in here to meet that 900 target. And I know you're in the right target area. I'm just not sure how to count the last 2 or 3 spaces, and wondering whether or not you should be counting them or not. And that's a question for future homework. And in 90 minutes is up. I'm done. And yes, I'm supposed to close this. Yeah, I know how to do that now. And so here we are at questions.
That's your closure, huh? Here we are.
Yeah.
Well, we have 5 questions the board's going to ask, and these questions are the same questions that we posed last weekend, that we'll pose again this afternoon, but the same 5 questions that each architectural firm were sent, and they've had an opportunity to formulate a response. And so, Heather, do you want to do first question, please?
Sure. To expedite the project delivery schedule, front funding has been discussed. What is your opinion related to this approach?
Well, the main advantage is timing. You can bid the project whenever you desire, thus avoiding the log jam of state match school projects that bid in July and August timeframe typically. And therefore you can time the project for completion at a more convenient time, say in the August timeframe before school starts, as opposed to sort of mid-year that would occur under the sort of normal funding cycle. The main disadvantage is the financing and cash flow. You must certify to OSPI that you have obtained all the funds needed to build the project. In the rare occurrence that they might not come through with the funding. Thus, you must finance about 25% more dollars in your bond pursuit, and the initial tax impact would go up likewise. Later, when the state rebates the money, its share, you can use that to pay down the debt, but you won't get the money back until the end of the project. So, in the meantime, it's sort of a troubling campaign issue where the voters need to be convinced to, or they need to agree to vote more debt initially and put trust in the fact that the state will eventually come back and pay their share and recoup that to the community.
Okay. I have the second one. It's a 2-part question. One of the facility locations identified in earlier bond presentations is the current high school campus. You've done a good job presenting that. The first part, do you see any issue mixing middle school and high school students on the same campus? The flip side of that is, do you see any issue mixing middle school students and elementary students on the same campus?
The very simple answer to both questions is not really in either case. It's certainly something that you have to be aware of and very cognizant of. When you have a middle school and a high school on the same site, there's some advantage that could take place of sharing the facilities. But we've done this repeatedly in the past, and it's just a matter of creating the appropriate separation, the appropriate outdoor zones. Kids will create mischief, and it's our goal to try to minimize those opportunities. But that's not going to be because a middle school and a high school is on the same site. As far as a middle school and an elementary school, that's what we did at one of the Cheney schools. One of those schools was built on the existing middle school site, and the other shared a site with the elementary school. And again, it was just a level of awareness. How do we separate the smaller kids' play area and define those zones and have them be separate from the bigger kids? How do we make sure that the traffic patterns for bus and parent drop-offs is clear and to both the parents and the kids coming to and from the site? But bottom line, we've done it before, and I think we can successfully do it again. There's no major concerns.
Okay, thank you. Bill?
Based on the fact that groundwater was an issue that impacted the budget of the high school project, what will you do to eliminate that impact on the middle school project?
I'm glad we had a high school question, because I'd like to apply a little bit of
You
knowledge.
you should know a lot about this.
Yeah, we should,
this one.
shouldn't we? One of the things that happened at the high school project was that the initial soil testing was somewhat limited, and it was also done at a particular time of year when the groundwater was at its lower level, and so everybody thought we were okay. But it turns out there's quite a bit of fluctuation in the seasonal groundwater, especially in this area, and so as we started to prepare the building pad, things had changed, and a lot of the soils were unsuitable just because of this fluctuating groundwater. So while we did have some over excavation and replacement with some better structural material, there were a lot of areas where we had to do that after the fact, and that's where it becomes really expensive. Here we have the benefit of hindsight. We would recommend not just soil testing in this area. It would be more comprehensive than that, and we would recommend even just a monitoring program be set up, ideally for an entire calendar year, just to know exactly what sort of groundwater fluctuations we're talking about. But at the minimum, through at least an irrigation season, to really try to get a handle on what those fluctuations, what they are, and how they're going to impact the soil and the footprint of any new school on that site. Again, I don't think we don't have the power to eliminate that problem, but what we do have is the hindsight and the knowledge going forward that it will most likely be an issue, so we can work that into the design, into the construction process.
The geotech guys would install what are called piezometers, and that's a fancy name for a piece of PVC pipe in the ground, and that allows them to go down and see what the water level is in any given depth. And we've used those on the Eastern Washington University campus, which has fluctuating groundwater and gives us this kind of annual readout of where those vulnerable zones are. And so it's just a matter of exhaustive testing and finding out where the zones of vulnerability are, and then building structural fill in those places in advance rather than on the fly during construction when it's so expensive on a change order basis.
That the question presumes that the high school, new middle school will be at the high school site. Any differences if it was at the middle Morgan site? Would your process still be the same?
It would depend on the geology and kind of the groundwater behavior in that area, but we understand that this fluctuation is kind of pretty pervasive through most of Ellensburg.
Curtis, you want to do number 4?
Okay. The capacity of a new middle school has been debated in previous bond elections. What is your opinion related to building for the future about capacity as it currently exists?
You're asking the ultimate crystal ball question, and I'm not sure that our crystal ball is any less foggy than yours. But since we get that asked so often, I'll give you kind of a framework of perspective. I'm not sure it's a great answer, but at least it gives you some framework to hang your hat on. And that is that, first of all, we look at the OSPI cohorts. And the cohorts suggest that for the next 5 years, your middle school enrollment is going to be relatively flat. But behind that, you've got some significant potential for growth. And if you project those numbers into the subsequent 5 years, those growth numbers, if they all transferred, would be in the range of 15%. You'd have to diminish that. Demographers will tell you that you will suffer some attrition. So I'm not sure what that attrition rate is, but it's going to be less than 15% growth. And so in the years 5 through, what it says is that if you were to target your middle school for something around its present size, you're probably going to be okay for somewhere in the range of 5 to 8 years. But at that point in time, you're going to have to make some accommodations for additional housing. You would be able to do that in a couple of ways. One way is to start to put teachers on carts and to use their prep periods for actual teaching units. And there is a limitation to that. What that does is allow your efficiency use of the school, which starts out being used every teaching station 5 out of 6 periods, or 83%. You're starting off at 83% efficiency. You can never get to 100. You can't take away all of those prep periods. You can never get to 100% efficiency, but you can move that needle up by 7, 8, 9 percentage points. So you can kind of displace people and make that work in your 8th to 10th year, 6th, 7th, 8th year. Or you can begin to add space to the middle school. The bigger question is, so somewhere at probably in an 8 to 10 year time frame, you're going to be faced with how to find more capacity at Morgan. So that flips you back to the question of, do you want to pre-buy expansion at Morgan? And just kind of looking at the differential between the size that you are and the size that you've targeted at 900, that's about 6 classrooms. So 6 classrooms on a pro rata share of the overall budget cost is about $2.7 million. And $2.7 million of your 98 cents per thousand assessment on the $38 million, let's say you could roll that back, that's about 6 or 7 cents out of that. So do you want to capture that 6 or 7 cent savings, or do you want to pre-buy those additional classrooms and probably stretch your growth potential out to about 15 years plus or minus, which means that you would be paying off your bonds about the time that you would be filling up the school. So, I mean, there aren't any black and white answers to any of this. These are all kind of judgment calls that you would have to make. And I don't know if it's a smart thing to pre-buy that or not. In the case, another approach would be what Cheney Middle School folks did. And they said, let's build the core big enough for our ultimate growth, but let's not build as many classrooms as needed for the long-term future, and we'll be prepared to add those classrooms in the future when that growth shows up. And we won't be squeezed out of our school because our core spaces, our cafeteria spaces, our common spaces, our library, our gym spaces, all those things that are very difficult to add on to, they're already sized for the larger approach. So that's kind of another intermediate approach. But I've rambled around a little bit, but I hope I've given you a sense of how you can sort of find your target and get comfortable with that target and the cost implications of that.
Heather, you got the last question?
What is your recommendation in terms of design space to deal with typical large events such as plays, concerts, graduation, etc. in a middle school facility?
So, performing arts, I think, is at the core of this question. And it admittedly is a traditional stage with fly loft and a house seating arrangement is not something commonly placed in middle schools. There are very few examples of that around the state. We do it most oftentimes in high schools. Virtually all high schools have them. We did do a performing arts center for OMAC back in the 80s, and that's sort of the...
You did that?
We did that. Steve knows a lot about
You-
that one.
Well, I was going to say, that's phenomenal for OMAG out in north central Washington. I mean, rival anything on the west side, particularly Seattle. Yeah, amazing. Okay, I'm sorry.
It's okay. And it really is sort of the jewel of the community. And it of course is at their middle school and adjacent to their high school, so it has a similar sort of correlation to what we're talking about here. Sort of another story might be Sela School District, where their existing auditorium was in their Lentz Elementary building, which was originally a high school. And over the years, they made some changes to the building and put a little too much load on the balcony, which caused a structural failure, and ultimately the building was condemned and no longer usable for the community. And that was the only performing arts venue in that community. So when they were looking at their bond election and debating what needed to be done, they knew that it was really critical to that community to have a performing arts venue in their middle school. It was their only opportunity to do something. They didn't want to pour money down the rat hole of the condemned building. That building has so many problems, it just has to be replaced eventually, but they couldn't do that now. They couldn't put that big of a bond measure package together. So, and I think in Ellensburg you have some similarities. I mean, you have a facility that is deficient in some ways relative to contemporary performing arts usage. It doesn't have a fly loft. It has inadequate wing space. There's a lot of accessibility problems in that space, and it too is in a portion of a building that's currently unusable because of some code issues, and you're currently facilitating those kinds of big events over at the community college, which is sort of a good workaround, but I think optimally you'd want to move that back in-house, so to speak. So it may be that the question is better answered in terms of what does the community need versus is it the norm to put such a thing in a middle school? And I really think that comes down to sort of evaluating community perceptions about that and coming to conclusions. I don't think we can tell you the right answer, but there are certainly some good stories out there about how it's been done successfully, and we've been involved in those stories. So,
Thank you. That takes care of our 5 programmed, I guess, for lack of a better word, questions, and we have one more. And this one here, just so long as you folks know, is that we did ask this of the other 2, and we will ask it with Architects West, is that this is a question we put together, and it's not a trick question. It's a question that they haven't seen, and just like any, I'm sure they're just like anybody else, particularly school board members, you get asked a question and they're in Safeway aisle, and say, I want an answer now. And so how do you think on your feet, and then what kind of response? And so that's the intent. And so Bill, if you want to ask the question, then we'll give you a few minutes to formulate a response, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, just a little bit more clarification for those that are tuning in. the purpose of the question really was to recognize that first, this is an open school board meeting. Second, it is a published or a televised meeting, and so anybody in the region can tune into the meeting. But more importantly, we wanted to see how the team that was with us simply worked together in a short period of time, 5 minutes, to put together the answer for a question that really doesn't have a lot of relevance. But we think it's a good question. So with that and one last clarification, we'll give the question after this afternoon's interview to the newspaper, so anybody who is tuned in and who is just dying of curiosity as to what the question is, you'll be able to read about it on Monday. So based on that, we'll give Northwest Architects a 5-minute period now to develop the answer to this great question. Point of clarification, guys, I'd like you not to reveal the question in the answer, okay?
I'm sure Architects West is watching. If you want to see a phenomenal performing arts, go to OMAC. You know, you think if you walk in there, you think you're in downtown Seattle.
That's pretty nice.
But the interesting thing about that one was it was a lot of private money that came in the bank
Oh,
on a lot of that. So, but it's phenomenal.
how big what's the population?
OMAC? Couple thousand maybe.
Was that all?
It's not very big. Community, this was a result of performing arts issues, and we took a bus and we went and visited Reardon and looked at their performing arts and their new structure, you know, and an auditorium, you know, that was also made
In Reardon?
Reardon.
Yeah.
But this also, Reardon was where they built a brand new high school and the middle school, it's all together.
Oh,
And then how did they address performing arts? And we toured that. We toured East Wenatchee, and that's phenomenal. And OMAC. So it kind of gave an interesting insight.
what kind of money was the OMAC?
All right. This is
I think they turned it off. Briefly,
I was just saying that's what that was. So.
yeah.
But we had a band full of them, and we took the soup You want to come up here at the podium so they can, folks at home can see you and hear you? So you're not going to reveal the question because I'm sure Architects West is tuning in, so.
Well, I'm, when you asked the unstated question, I wrote down that it was irrelevant and, that it wasn't relevant and that I was in the Safeway aisle. So I consider me standing in the middle of Safeway here.
Just like a board member.
So I guess I want to begin by saying that we understand the kind of the context of where the question comes from. And we've had many similar assignments, most recently in Pullman, where we succeeded helping them to pass a bond with a 78% majority. And that's, that's a college town with a perimeter agricultural base. So I think we're kind of tuned into the variations in the cultures of those kind of towns. And we understand the kind of the background that you folks have struggled with as a small community, and maybe sort of fractured, divisive in terms of what the outcome should be and where we can kind of help you bridge some of those gaps. We've done a lot of studying up on your current position. I revealed, not in a not too comprehensive way, but would like to do more thoroughly, how would we approach the analysis of the program? And I think that'll tell you a lot, answer the community questions about what is actually needed in this facility, both for its present size and what the crystal ball should say about its future size and present growth. We have a lot of experience in community facilitation. Presently, I just worked with Moses Lake School District developing its long-range plan and helping them try to define what their future needs are and message that to their community. I'm working with Spokane Public Schools in its current capital bond cycle, trying to ramp up for a $140 million bond issue. And I guess I'd like to say that we bring a fresh set of eyes to this, but with that fresh set of eyes, we bring a lot of applicable experience. And that experience, I think we're prepared to apply in a very open-minded way, in a very objective way. And we don't, while we go through these planning processes and we do find our way to certain biases, I think we're very disciplined about suppressing those biases and not sort of gaming the presentation or the outcome to direct it towards a given solution. I think we work very hard to let the solution flow from you and from the community and let you weigh those decisions and come to your appropriate conclusions for you, and then jump on board with those and make that play out as best we can. We've worked with school districts that have failed their bonds in the past, either with other architects or even with us, but we have stuck with them and figured out where our weaknesses were and how to overcome those weaknesses and turn those